There is a particular kind of man who loses everything, not because he lacks talent, not because the world was against him, but because he could not be still. He reacted too quickly, spoke too soon, moved before the moment was ready. He was capable, perhaps even brilliant, but he was always one impulsive decision away from undoing everything he had built. If you have ever watched your own life unravel in slow motion and wondered how a single moment of reaction could cost you so much, then what follows was written for you. Chapter 1. The Man Who Could Not Stop Moving. His name was Daniel. He was 34 years old, and by every external measure, he had succeeded. He ran a small but growing business, had a family, owned a home in a city he had chosen deliberately. But inside, he was in a state of constant emergency. Every email demanded an immediate reply. Every problem at work required his intervention within the hour. Every conversation his wife tried to have about their relationship was met with defensiveness, followed by apology, followed by the same behavior repeated. He was never still. And because he was never still, he was never truly present, never truly powerful, and never truly free. He had read books on productivity. He had tried meditation apps. He had even taken a weekend retreat focused on mindfulness, returned home feeling calm, and by Tuesday morning was back in the same reactive spiral. The problem was not that he lacked tools. The problem was that he had never understood, at a foundational level, what stillness actually is. He thought stillness was the absence of activity. He thought it was something you did in the morning for 20 minutes before the real day began. He had no idea that stillness, in the oldest traditions of human mastery, is not a practice you schedule. It is a weapon you carry at all times. Chapter 2. What the Samurai Knew. In feudal Japan, there was a concept studied not only by monks in mountain temples, but by warriors whose lives depended on the accuracy of their perception. That concept was called Mushin, which translates roughly as no mind. It is a state in which the practitioner is fully alert, fully present, and yet entirely free from the grip of reactive thought. It is not emptiness. It is clarity. It is the condition in which a warrior can see what is actually in front of him, rather than what his fear or desire or ego insists is there. Miyamoto Musashi, the greatest swordsman Japan ever produced, understood this principle at a level most people never reach in any domain of life. Musashi fought over 60 duels and survived every one. He was not the largest man. He was not always the most technically skilled. What he possessed developed over decades of brutal self-examination and voluntary hardship was the ability to be completely still inside while everything outside moved. His opponents would arrive full of anger, full of strategy, full of the desperate need to prove themselves. Musashi would wait. He would arrive late to duels deliberately, a practice his contemporaries read as arrogance. But it was not arrogance. It was a calculated disruption of his opponent's inner stillness, a way of forcing them to wait, to stew in their own anxiety, to lose their Mushin before the first blow was ever struck. He understood something that most people in the modern world have completely forgotten, that the man who remains still longest holds the greatest power. Musashi wrote about this in the Book of Five Rings, a text composed not for aristocrats or philosophers, but for warriors preparing for real combat. He described the importance of what he called the void, a mental space not of confusion, but of complete openness. He wrote that a warrior who clings to a fixed strategy is already defeated, because reality will always present something the strategy did not account for. The warrior who can receive reality without flinching, without rushing to impose his preferred narrative upon it, is the warrior who survives. This was not mysticism. This was the most practical philosophy of combat ever written. Chapter 3. The physiology of reaction. To understand why stillness is so difficult and why it is so powerful when achieved, it helps to understand what is actually happening inside a human being who cannot stop reacting. The nervous system, when under perceived threat, activates a cascade of physiological responses that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to help our ancestors survive immediate physical danger. The problem is that this system cannot distinguish between a lion in the grass and an email from a difficult client. It responds to both with the same urgency, the same narrowing of perception, the same demand for immediate action. When Daniel received a critical message from a business partner, his hands would tighten before he had even finished reading it. His thoughts would race to responses, counter-arguments, defenses. He would type something, delete it, type something else, send it before he was ready, and spend the next 3 hours regretting it. He was not weak. He was human. But he was allowing his ancient biology to make decisions that required wisdom, not speed. The samurai did not have the vocabulary of neuroscience, but they mapped this territory with extraordinary precision through direct observation of their own minds in conditions of mortal stress. They knew that the reactive impulse was not to be trusted. They built entire systems of training designed to interrupt it. The first of these systems was not swordsmanship. It was sitting. Long before a student of the way of the sword ever touched a blade, he was taught to sit in silence, not to think, not to plan, not to review his failures or rehearse his victories, to sit and to observe the interior weather of his own mind with the same calm detachment one might use to watch clouds moving across a mountain. This practice was not preparation for combat. It was the foundation of it. Chapter 4. The year. Daniel stopped explaining himself. The turning point for Daniel did not come from a book or a retreat or a therapist's office, though each of those things had its place. It came from a conversation with an older man he met at a conference, a man in his late 60s who carried himself with an unusual quality of presence. Not the presence of someone performing calm, but the presence of someone who had genuinely arrived somewhere most people never reach. Daniel asked him, in the casual way people ask questions they do not expect to be answered seriously, how he had become so composed. The old man looked at him for a moment before speaking. He said, "I stopped explaining myself, not out of pride, and not because I stopped caring what people thought. I stopped because I realized that every time I rushed to explain, I was operating from fear. Fear that I would be misunderstood. Fear that I would be judged. And the moment I noticed that the rush to explain was actually the voice of fear, I was able to pause. And in that pause, I found that most of the time, nothing needed to be said at all." Daniel drove home from that conference in silence. He did not play music. He did not call anyone. He sat with what the man had said, letting it move through him slowly, the way you let a stone settle to the bottom of a still pool. He did not fully understand it yet, but something had shifted, the way a door that has been stuck for years will sometimes move just slightly in the frame before it finally opens. Chapter 5. The principle of Ma. In Japanese aesthetics and philosophy, there is a concept called Ma, which is most commonly translated as negative space or pause, but which carries a depth that translation cannot fully capture. Ma is the space between notes in music that gives the notes their meaning. It is the silence between words that allows the words to land. It is the gap between stimulus and response, in which a human being either acts with wisdom or reacts with fear. Every master in Japanese tradition, whether a swordsman, a painter, a calligrapher, or a tea ceremony practitioner, was trained to develop a profound sensitivity to Ma. The tea ceremony, which many Westerners regard as merely a beautiful ritual, was in fact a complete training system for the cultivation of Ma. Every movement in the ceremony was deliberate. Every pause was intentional. The host did not rush. The guests did not speak unnecessarily. The entire space of the ceremony was constructed to teach participants, through direct physical experience, what it feels like to exist in the absence of urgency. And the lesson was not meant to stay in the tea room. It was meant to travel with the practitioner into every domain of life, into commerce, into conflict, into family, into the long and difficult work of becoming a fully realized human being. What Daniel began to understand, slowly, over the months following that conversation, was that he had been living his entire adult life without Ma. There was no pause anywhere. His mornings moved immediately into the demands of the day. His conversations were full of the noise of his own thinking, which prevented him from hearing what was actually being said. His responses to difficulty came before he had understood the difficulty. He had been conducting his life like a musician who plays every note at maximum volume, without rest, without variation, without silence. The result was not music. It was noise. Chapter 6. The Discipline of Not Acting. One of the most counterintuitive teachings in the samurai tradition is that the discipline of not acting is harder to develop than the discipline of acting. Any man can be trained to charge. It takes a different kind of warrior entirely to stand still in the face of provocation and choose consciously, deliberately, from a place of genuine power rather than fear, not to respond. This is what the Japanese called Zanshin, a term often translated as remaining mind or continuing awareness, a state in which the warrior does not lower his guard after the threat has passed, does not relax into the comfort of assumed safety, but remains continuously present and alert without becoming tense or rigid. Musashi's later years offer perhaps the most extraordinary example of this principle in lived practice. After his final and most famous duel against Sasaki Kojiro, Musashi largely withdrew from the world of combat. He spent his remaining years in a cave in voluntary austerity, writing, painting, and practicing the arts with the same intensity he had once devoted to the sword. Many of his contemporaries read this withdrawal as retreat. It was, in fact, the final and most advanced expression of his philosophy. He had proven himself in combat. He no longer needed to prove himself to anyone. He had achieved Mushin not just in battle but in life, and life, for a man who has achieved that, requires no performance. The lesson here is not that one should withdraw from the world. Most people reading this will have obligations, families, careers, communities that need them present and engaged. The lesson is that engagement without stillness is exhausting and ultimately ineffective. The warrior who fights from ego, from the need to be seen, from the fear of being diminished, will burn himself out long before he accomplishes what he was capable of. The warrior who has made peace with his own interior life, who no longer needs external validation to feel secure, who acts from stillness rather than from anxiety, can sustain his engagement indefinitely, and his actions will carry a weight and precision that reactive behavior never can. Chapter 7. What Daniel built in the silence. Over the following year, Daniel made a series of quiet changes that were nearly invisible from the outside, but that transformed his inner life entirely. He stopped checking his phone for the first hour of every morning, not because he read that this was a good habit, but because he had begun to understand that the first hour of consciousness is the hour in which the mind is most vulnerable, to being seized by the urgency of the external world. And he had decided that he would not surrender that hour to anyone. He used it to sit, to think slowly, to read the kind of writing that asks something of the reader rather than delivering easy answers. He stopped defending himself in arguments with his wife, not by conceding everything she said, but by learning to sit with her frustration long enough to actually hear what was underneath it, which was almost never what the argument appeared to be about on the surface. This was the hardest practice of all, harder than any physical discipline, harder than waking early or working late. To be still in the presence of someone else's pain and not immediately try to solve it, defend against it, or escape from it, required a quality of courage he had not previously known he was capable of. Stillness is a weapon, because it changes the conditions in which every encounter occurs. The man who is still does not telegraph his intentions. He does not reveal his wounds under pressure. He does not need to fill silence with the noise of his own anxiety, which means that in any conversation, any negotiation, any moment of conflict, he is the one who controls the temperature of the room without ever trying to control it. People feel this quality without being able to name it. They trust it without understanding why. They are drawn toward it the way people are drawn toward a fire in a dark room, not because the fire demands anything of them, but because it provides light and warmth by simply being what it is. This is what Musashi understood. This is what the masters of the tea ceremony understood. This is what every serious practitioner of Zen has discovered in their own way, that the most powerful force available to a human being is not aggression, not cleverness, not the frantic energy of someone who needs to win. It is the settled, unshakable quality of a person who has done the interior work, who has sat with his own fear long enough to stop being controlled by it, who has learned to wait, and in that waiting, to perceive more clearly than those around him who are still running. Daniel did not become a different person. He became more fully the person he had always been underneath the noise. The quality that his children now felt in his presence when he sat with them, unhurried and genuinely attentive, was not a technique. It was the result of years of quiet discipline applied in the interior spaces of his life, where no one could see it and no one could verify it except through the evidence of who he was becoming. That is how the samurai understood mastery, not as something performed for an audience, but as something lived in the moments no one is watching, in the thoughts you have before you speak, in the pause you choose before you act, in the quality of presence you bring to an ordinary afternoon with the people who depend on you. Conclusion: the practice never ends. Musashi died in 1645 in a cave on Mount Iwado, having spent his final years in complete voluntary simplicity. He did not die famous by the standards of his own culture. He did not hold a position of political power. He had no students to carry on a school in his name. What he left behind was a short stack of manuscripts and the enduring record of a life lived with absolute fidelity to a single question: what does it mean to be fully awake inside your own existence? He found his answer not in action, but in the space between actions. Not in the sword, but in the stillness from which each sword stroke arose. The invitation of this teaching, and it is an invitation, not a command, not a prescription, is simply to consider the quality of your own interior life, not as a project to be optimized or a problem to be solved, but as the central ground from which everything else in your life emerges. When you are still, you see clearly. When you see clearly, you act wisely. When you act wisely, you cause less harm, achieve more of what actually matters, and move through the world with a kind of authority that cannot be faked or purchased or performed. It can only be earned in the small, unglamorous, daily practice of choosing stillness when every instinct tells you to react. That is the weapon. It was always inside you. The only question is whether you are willing to do the work required to use it.